blood trickled down Jerome Taylor's face as three masked men cornered him in the alley. The tech billionaire fumbled for his phone. "Please take my wallet. Take everything." A rubber ball suddenly struck the first attacker's head with shocking force. Then another, then another. All three men collapsed before identifying their unseen assailant. A small black boy stepped from the shadows, baseball clutched tight, staring wide-eyed at the fallen men. Neither knew this chance encounter would expose corruption at the city's highest levels, reshape a community's future, and force them both to confront America's deepest racial wounds. The morning sun barely penetrated the worn blinds of apartment 4B in Pinewood Heights as 10-year-old Darius Williams carefully wrapped athletic tape around his fingers, a ritual he performed every day before practice, each movement precise and deliberate, as if preparing for a professional game rather than another lonely session in the abandoned lot 3 blocks from his home in Ashton, Michigan. The apartment was quiet, except for the gentle hum of the refrigerator that occasionally sputtered, threatening to quit like so many other appliances in their modest 2-bedroom home, but Darius paid no attention to the familiar sounds of poverty as he focused entirely on his preparation, his mind already on the makeshift pitcher's mound he had created from discarded bricks and packed dirt. His mother Janelle had already left for her first job at the hospital cafeteria, where she worked from 6 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon before heading to her evening shift at the convenience store. A punishing schedule that left her exhausted but still barely able to keep up with rent increases. As Westfield Corporation systematically bought properties throughout Pinewood with promises of urban renewal that seemed to translate primarily into eviction notices for families who had lived there for generations. Darius glanced at the clock and realized he would need to wake his 16-year-old brother Marcus soon for school, a task that grew more difficult each day, as Marcus increasingly questioned the value of education in a system he felt was designed for him to fail, his once bright academic prospects dimming with each encounter with teachers who seemed to expect less of him than his white classmates, with each job application rejected, with each police car that slowed when he walked down the street with friends. The Williams family had once been 5 instead of 3, but their father James had disappeared 3 years ago, after losing his factory job when the plant relocated to Mexico, leaving behind only his cherished baseball that he had once promised would be replaced by one signed by a major league player when Darius made it to the big leagues someday, a dream that seemed increasingly distant as the community baseball field had been closed and fenced off 2 years ago, another property now owned by Westfield and awaiting transformation. Darius carefully placed his father's baseball in his backpack, though he rarely used it for practice, preferring the rubber ball he had bought with birthday money because it bounced back from the brick wall he used as a target, allowing him to practice alone for hours, perfecting his remarkable throwing accuracy that seemed almost supernatural to the few who had witnessed it, a talent recognized most notably by Mr. Henderson, the former high school baseball coach who occasionally stopped by to watch Darius practice and offer pointers despite having no formal connection to the boy. School was a different kind of battlefield for Darius, where his academic struggles were frequently attributed to lack of effort or capacity rather than the overwhelming challenges of poverty, unstable housing, and a system that seemed to view him as another statistic waiting to happen, another problem child from Pinewood destined to drop out, despite test scores that indicated significant intelligence when given appropriate support and encouragement. Mrs. Winters, his 5th-grade teacher, had already held 2 conferences with Janelle about Darius's behavioral issues, which primarily consisted of his tendency to stare out the window during lessons and draw baseball diamonds in his notebook instead of taking notes, minor infractions that somehow warranted more severe responses than the disruptive antics of his white classmates like Tyler Bennington, whose family name adorned several buildings downtown. The only bright spot in Darius's school day was recess, where his throwing abilities earned him reluctant respect even from children who otherwise avoided the poor kids from Pinewood, his accuracy with a ball transforming him temporarily from invisible to impressive, though the admiration rarely translated into actual friendships that extended beyond the playground. Afternoon practice had become Darius's religion, his sanctuary, the place where the world made sense and where he controlled his destiny with each perfectly aimed throw, each calculated adjustment to his grip or stance, improvements meticulously tracked in a tattered notebook where he recorded distances, accuracy percentages, and velocity estimates based on how the rubber ball felt, leaving his fingertips and striking his targets. Today's practice would need to be shorter than usual, because he had promised his mother he would pick up groceries with the $20 bill she had left on the counter, a responsibility that filled him with both pride at being trusted and anxiety about making the limited funds stretch to cover enough food for 3 people until Friday. As Darius finished packing his school bag, adding his rubber ball to the side pocket where he could easily access it, he had no way of knowing that his path home from practice would take him through the alley behind the old theater, a shortcut he had used dozens of times before, where today his extraordinary talent would collide with the carefully constructed world of Jerome Taylor, the reclusive billionaire CEO of Westfield Corporation, whose decisions shaped the fate of entire communities like Pinewood from the insulated comfort of boardrooms and private jets, a man Darius had never met, but whose company logo appeared on the chain-link fence surrounding the baseball field of his dreams, a man whose life was about to be saved by a child his policies had helped impoverish. Jerome Taylor adjusted his rimless glasses and suppressed a sigh as Mayor Williams droned on about community engagement and stakeholder perspectives, corporate buzzwords that politicians had learned to parrot back to executives like himself, as if adopting the language of business might disguise the fundamental transactional nature of these meetings, where power and money simply wore the thin mask of public interest. The 45-year-old CEO of Westfield Corporation had spent the morning in closed-door sessions with Ashton city leadership, reviewing plans for what company marketing materials called the Pinewood Renaissance Initiative, but which internal documents more directly labeled Acquisition and Development Phase 3, a 5-year strategy to transform the struggling neighborhood into commercial properties and upscale residential units that would increase the city's tax base and Westfield's profit margins. Taylor had built his technology company into a real estate powerhouse through careful analysis and strategic risk assessment, expanding beyond software into physical assets when market conditions shifted, a pivot that had tripled his personal wealth to $4.2 billion and earned him features in Businessweek and Fortune, though he generally avoided publicity and rarely granted interviews, preferring the analytical solitude of spreadsheets and projection models to the performative requirements of public corporate leadership. The boardroom on the top floor of City Hall offered a panoramic view of downtown Ashton, the gleaming office buildings, and recently developed waterfront district, standing in sharp contrast to the visible decline of neighborhoods like Pinewood just beyond, a visual representation of the economic segregation that characterized so many American cities where prosperity and poverty existed in uncomfortable proximity, separated by invisible lines of policy and prejudice that Jerome Taylor's developments often redefined but rarely erased. As the meeting finally concluded with handshakes and promises of continued collaboration, Taylor declined his security director's suggestion of a car back to the Westfield regional offices, suddenly feeling claustrophobic after hours of political maneuvering and corporate performance, instead informing his team that he would walk the 12 blocks and meet them later, dismissing their concerns about the route with the casual confidence of a man unaccustomed to having his decisions questioned or his movements restricted. The late afternoon air carried the first hints of autumn as Taylor loosened his tie and stepped onto the less-traveled side streets that would take him through parts of the city not featured in economic development brochures. His mind still occupied with projection models and construction timelines rather than his surroundings, until he realized he had inadvertently wandered into Pinewood itself, the very neighborhood that existed on his company's spreadsheets as property values and acquisition costs rather than as homes and lives. Deciding to take a shortcut through an alley that would redirect him toward the downtown district, Taylor was calculating potential tax incentives for the Phase 3 developments when the first man stepped out from behind a dumpster, followed quickly by 2 others, their faces obscured by dark bandanas, and their intentions immediately clear from their posture and the baseball bat, the tallest one, carried casually over his shoulder. "Well, look what we got here," the first man said, his voice carrying a performative toughness that barely masked genuine malice. "You're a long way from the penthouse, Mr. Taylor." The recognition sent a chill through the billionaire. The realization that this was not a random crime of opportunity, but something targeted, something planned. His mind racing to identify potential enemies, even as he raised his hands in a universal gesture of surrender, and tried to keep his voice steady as he offered his wallet, his watch, his phone, anything they wanted, if they would just let him walk away. The tallest attacker laughed, a sound devoid of humor, as he explained that his employer had a message regarding Westfield's expansion plans, specifically about the importance of choosing the right local partners, and that some lessons were best delivered physically to ensure they were properly understood. The name Carson Industries was mentioned just before the first blow landed, connecting Taylor's current situation to his corporate rivalry with Victor Carson, whose development company had competed unsuccessfully for several city contracts recently awarded to Westfield, though this violent escalation seemed extreme even in the context of their increasingly bitter business conflict. The first strike sent pain radiating through Taylor's shoulder and drove him to his knees, his glasses skittering across the dirty alley floor as he tried unsuccessfully to shield himself from the subsequent blows. His wealth and power suddenly meaningless in this narrow space between buildings, where violence was the only currency that mattered. Blood trickled from his forehead into his eyes as he fumbled blindly for his phone, no longer attempting to reason with his attackers, but simply desperate to call for help. To survive this encounter that had transformed in his mind from a robbery to what felt increasingly like a potential murder, his analytical brain still functioning enough to recognize that men who didn't conceal their employer's identity had little incentive to leave witnesses. What happened next occurred so quickly that Taylor, dazed from the attacks, initially struggled to process the sequence of events. A small object streaked through the air with astonishing velocity, striking the tallest attacker precisely at the temple, with enough force to drop him immediately to the ground, followed in rapid succession by two more projectiles that found their targets with equal accuracy, rendering all three men unconscious or incapacitated within seconds. The sudden silence in the alley was broken only by Taylor's ragged breathing and the soft footfalls of someone approaching cautiously from the direction the projectiles had originated, revealing themselves to be not the expected police officer or Good Samaritan, but a small black boy, no more than 10 years old, thin frame partially hidden by an oversized T-shirt bearing the faded logo of a baseball team, clutching what Taylor now recognized as a rubber ball, similar to the ones that had just possibly saved his life. The boy's expression contained a complex mixture of emotions that Taylor couldn't fully decipher through his own shock and the absence of his glasses. Fear, certainly, but also determination and something like indignation, as if the violence he had just witnessed and interrupted had offended some deep sense of justice or fair play. For a long moment they simply stared at each other, the billionaire CEO and the child from Pinewood, connected by circumstance and separated by nearly everything else, until the sound of approaching sirens broke their mutual assessment and prompted the boy to speak. His voice surprisingly steady as he asked if Taylor was badly hurt and whether he should run before the police arrived, a question that revealed volumes about his lived experience and expectations of how authorities might interpret a scenario involving a white man injured in an alley and a black child at the scene. Taylor, whose interactions with law enforcement had been limited to respectful conversations with his company's security personnel or the occasional traffic ticket handled by his lawyers, suddenly glimpsed the profound difference in their realities. Recognizing that the boy's fear of being blamed rather than praised was neither irrational nor unfounded in a country where such assumptions followed predictable patterns. When the police cars screeched to a halt at the alley entrance moments later, Taylor made a split-second decision that would alter both their lives, calling out to the officers before they could draw weapons or make their own assessments of the scene, his voice carrying the unearned but real authority of wealth and whiteness as he declared, "This boy saved my life," a simple truth that would soon become complicated by everything else it set in motion. The fluorescent lights of Ashton Memorial Hospital cast harsh shadows across Jerome Taylor's face as doctors finished applying 6 stitches to the laceration on his forehead, the minor procedure taking place in a private room that normally served as an administrative office, but had been hastily repurposed to accommodate the billionaire patient while avoiding the public exposure of the emergency department. Waiting area. Detective Marcus Harlow stood nearby, notebook open but largely empty, as Taylor recounted the attack for the 3rd time, each retelling consistent in its details, yet frustratingly vague regarding the specific connections to Carson Industries. The businessman reluctant to formally accuse a corporate rival of orchestrating violence without irrefutable evidence, despite his certainty about what he had heard during the assault. A television mounted in the corner of the room played silently, closed captions scrolling across breaking news coverage that described the incident as a brutal gang attack in a troubled neighborhood, the accompanying footage showing police cars surrounding the alley while a reporter gestured solemnly toward the crime scene tape, perpetuating narratives about Pinewood that its residents would recognize as familiar and false in equal measure. Outside in a small waiting area, Darius Williams sat rigidly between his mother Janelle and Coach Henderson, who had been contacted when police couldn't immediately locate Janelle at either of her workplaces, the boy's expression carefully neutral as he watched uniformed officers and plain-clothes detectives move through the corridor, years of warnings about interactions with police evident in his perfect stillness and monosyllabic responses to questions. Janelle's face showed the complex emotions of a mother, navigating between pride in her son's courage and terror at how differently the situation could have ended. Her work uniform still on, as she had rushed directly from the convenience store after receiving Coach Henderson's call. Losing wages she couldn't afford to sacrifice, but unwilling to let Darius face authorities alone in a system she knew from experience rarely gave the benefit of doubt to black children, especially boys. The media narrative shifted dramatically the following morning when Jerome Taylor, against the advice of both his public relations team and his legal department, held an impromptu press conference from his hospital room, his bruised face lending gravitas to his statement, as he explicitly rejected characterizations of the incident as gang-related and instead identified his attackers as hired thugs connected to business interests, though still stopping short of naming Carson Industries directly for legal reasons. The billionaire's voice grew more animated, however, when he described how Darius Williams had intervened, praising the boy's extraordinary skill and courage, while expressing outrage at initial police assumptions that Darius might have been involved with the attackers, a prejudice Taylor acknowledged he might have shared himself before experiencing firsthand the character of the young man who had saved him. Despite having every reason to view someone like Taylor, whose company was buying up homes in Pinewood, as an adversary rather than someone deserving assistance. Social media exploded with competing narratives, some celebrating Darius as a hero while others questioned why a child was alone in a dangerous area, coded language that Janelle recognized as attempting to shift blame to her parenting rather than addressing the economic circumstances that required her to work multiple jobs, circumstances directly connected to corporations like Westfield. Conservative commentators speculated about gang connections despite the clear evidence to the contrary, while progressive voices seized on the story as emblematic of systemic issues without necessarily consulting the Williams family about becoming symbols in larger political discussions. The actual human beings at the center of the story reduced to convenient archetypes by observers across the ideological spectrum. 3 days after the attack, a black luxury SUV arrived unannounced at the Williams apartment building, drawing immediate attention in a neighborhood where such vehicles usually belonged either to drug dealers or police, neither of which tended to herald positive developments for residents. Jerome Taylor emerged from the back seat, his security team visibly uncomfortable as they scanned the surroundings and established a perimeter, their protective instincts honed to identify threats in environments far less challenging than an economically depressed neighborhood where their principal was already known to have been attacked once. The apartment building's exterior, once painted a cheerful yellow but now faded to a jaundiced hue, interrupted by patches of exposed concrete, featured a security door with a broken lock and an elevator perpetually marked as out of service, forcing Taylor and his reluctant security detail to climb 4 flights of narrow stairs that smelled faintly of urine and strongly of the various cuisines being prepared behind thin apartment doors. Janelle Williams answered Taylor's knock with understandable suspicion, initially blocking the doorway to prevent full view of their modest living conditions, pride and privacy being among the few possessions that poverty couldn't easily strip away. Though the presence of America's 823rd wealthiest individual, according to Forbes, made concealment largely symbolic. The billionaire's careful smile faltered momentarily as he took in the apartment's interior when finally invited inside. Water stains marking the ceiling, mismatched furniture clearly acquired second-hand, the kitchen consisting of appliances at least 2 decades old, windows that had been painted shut years ago, and a small living area where Darius sat completing homework at a coffee table, while Marcus watched him with the protective vigilance of an older brother who understood the world's threats more comprehensively than their mother might. Wish. The initial conversation was strained by the vast gulf of experience and circumstance that separated the Williams family from their unexpected visitor, courtesy and caution, creating a formal atmosphere until Darius tentatively asked if Taylor's head still hurt, a simple human question that somehow penetrated the artificial politeness and allowed for more genuine interaction. Taylor explained that he had come personally to thank Darius properly and to offer something in return for the boy's heroism, producing from his jacket a baseball signed by the entire roster of the Detroit Tigers, a gift that immediately transformed Darius's carefully maintained composure into unrestrained excitement as he examined the signatures with reverence. The real purpose of Taylor's visit emerged gradually as conversation continued. He had learned through background research that Westfield Corporation now owned the abandoned community baseball field that had once served Pinewood youth, including a younger Darius, before budget cuts and neglect had led to its closure, a facility currently slated for commercial redevelopment, but which Taylor now proposed to rebuild and modernize, as both a gesture of genuine gratitude and admittedly useful positive publicity for a company frequently criticized for its past of this come. Role in neighborhood transformation, a term local activists more bluntly called gentrification. Janelle's expression remained skeptical as Taylor outlined his proposal, which included not only renovating the baseball field but also establishing a college scholarship fund for Darius, her life experience having taught her that white benefactors often disappeared once their momentary guilt or interest faded, leaving broken promises and renewed disappointment in their wake. Why should we believe Westfield suddenly cares about Pinewood kids playing baseball when your company has been buying up homes and forcing families out for years? Janelle asked directly, her tone respectful but unflinching, unwilling to be dazzled by wealth or promises when her children's futures and her community's survival hung in the balance. Taylor's response surprised them with its candor, as he admitted that his interest began as personal gratitude rather than corporate responsibility, but that the attack and his encounter with Darius had forced him to confront the human consequences of development decisions previously viewed primarily through financial metrics and property values, an awakening that felt simultaneously genuine and inadequate given the systemic issues at play. The following week's hastily organized press conference at the chain-link fence surrounding the neglected baseball field created a media spectacle as cameras captured Jerome Taylor and Darius Williams cutting a ceremonial ribbon to announce the renovation project. The juxtaposition of the polished billionaire in his tailored suit and the 10-year-old boy in his best but visibly worn clothes, creating visual shorthand for a heartwarming narrative of cross-racial and cross-class connection that attracted national attention, though closer observers might have noticed Janelle Williams standing slightly apart from the celebration, her expression reflecting the complicated reality behind the carefully managed optics. Online comments, sections, and social media conversations about the event revealed the persistent racial divisions in American society as some commentators questioned Taylor's motives, suggesting the project was merely white guilt theater or speculating about tax benefits, while others directed disturbing racist messages toward the Williams family, deploying cruel stereotypes about handouts and inner-city youth that revealed how deeply threatened some felt by even symbolic gestures toward addressing inequality. Community reactions in Pinewood itself were equally divided, with many residents cautiously optimistic about both the baseball field and the attention to neighborhood conditions, while others like Marcus's friend Deshaun Jackson openly predicted that the field would ultimately become unaffordable housing once media attention shifted elsewhere, citing numerous historical precedents for skepticism about white institutional promises in black communities. Coach Henderson emerged as an unexpected bridge figure, his long history advocating for neighborhood youth giving him credibility with Pinewood residents, while his direct manner and clear baseball expertise seemed to earn Taylor's respect, the former high school coach accepting a formal position overseeing the field renovation with the explicit understanding that the facility would prioritize local children rather than becoming a showcase project disconnected from community needs. As autumn progressed and preliminary work began on clearing the overgrown field, Darius found himself navigating an increasingly complex set of social dynamics. At school, some teachers suddenly discovered his potential now that a wealthy white man had expressed interest in his future, while classmates alternated between impressed fascination and resentful accusations of having lucked into special treatment, the racial undertones of both reactions impossible to miss, even for a 10-year-old still developing the language to articulate such observations. At home, Janelle continued working both jobs, despite Taylor's hints about potential employment opportunities connected to Westfield, her fierce independence and lingering distrust making her reluctant to become financially dependent on the man's continued goodwill, even as she allowed Darius to attend special coaching sessions arranged by Taylor with a former minor league pitcher who praised the boy's natural talent as extraordinary. The unexpected alliance between the billionaire developer and the Pinewood family remained fragile, built on genuine gratitude but complicated by history, power imbalances, and the persistent reality that Taylor could walk away from their lives with minimal consequence, while the Williams family remained vulnerable to economic forces largely controlled by men like him, their tenuous connection existing within a society where race and class continued to determine not only opportunities, but often the very definition of heroism itself. Autumn winds scattered yellow and orange leaves across the construction site that had once been an abandoned baseball field, as workers operated excavation equipment, carefully following blueprints that called for regulation dimensions, proper drainage systems, and facilities that exceeded what had existed even when the field was originally maintained by the city decades earlier. Jerome Taylor stood near the future location of home plate, his expensive leather shoes incongruous against the churned earth, watching with evident satisfaction as the project he had personally championed proceeded on an accelerated timeline designed to have the field ready for spring, his corporate efficiency now directed toward a community asset rather than purely profit-driven development. Nearby, Darius Williams balanced on the low concrete wall that would eventually support proper bleachers, his eyes wide with unrestrained excitement as he tracked every aspect of the construction, occasionally calling out questions to the foreman who had taken a liking to the boy and answered with unexpected patience, explaining the purpose of different equipment and processes with the same seriousness he would use with an adult. The renovation project had quickly expanded beyond merely clearing the overgrown grass and replacing the rusted backstop, evolving into a comprehensive facility that would include lighting for evening games, proper dugouts, an electronic scoreboard, a concession building, and most impressively to Darius, a dedicated practice area with pitching machines and batting cages where young players could develop their skills regardless of weather conditions. What made the project particularly unusual, however, was Taylor's insistence that construction jobs be filled primarily by Pinewood residents whenever possible, a directive that initially met resistance from Westfield's usual contractors, but which the CEO personally enforced, resulting in employment opportunities for several dozen local workers, including Marcus Williams, who had reluctantly accepted a position after considerable encouragement from both his mother and Coach Henderson. the 16-year-old finding unexpected satisfaction in physical labor that produced visible results and provided his first legitimate paycheck. Community attitudes toward the project remained complex, but had shifted toward cautious optimism as people witnessed actual progress rather than merely promises. Though longtime residents like Mrs. Patterson, who had lived in Pinewood for 67 years, continued reminding younger neighbors about previous instances of announced improvements that had mysteriously lost funding or changed scope, once initial enthusiasm faded, institutional memory serving as both wisdom and warning. The most significant development in the evolving relationship between Taylor and Darius occurred 3 weeks into construction when the Billionaire arranged for Jackson Thompson, a retired Major League Baseball player who had spent 12 seasons as a starting pitcher for various teams and had been one of the sport's most prominent black athletes, to visit Ashton and assess Darius's abilities. The meeting took place at the construction site, deliberately casual in arrangement, but monumental in importance to Darius, who had spent the previous night too nervous to sleep, alternating between excitement at meeting a childhood hero and fear of disappointing both Thompson and Taylor with a poor performance. A temporary pitching area had been prepared for the occasion, with a portable mound and home plate set up on the only level portion of the site, creating a makeshift diamond where Thompson, still fit despite being in his early 50s, crouched with a catcher's mitt while Darius prepared to throw, the boy's hands trembling slightly as he gripped the baseball. Thompson's professional demeanor helped settle Darius's nerves, the former player treating the assessment with matter-of-fact seriousness rather than condescension, offering simple adjustments to grip and stance without overwhelming the boy with technical information, creating a focused environment where Darius could demonstrate his remarkable accuracy and surprisingly powerful throw for someone his size and age. After 20 minutes of increasingly challenging pitching exercises, Thompson straightened up and exchanged a significant look with Taylor before turning to Darius with a genuine smile, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder as he delivered an assessment that would stay with Darius forever. "Son, I've seen grown men in the majors with less natural accuracy than you have at 10 years old. You've got a gift. And with proper coaching and development, there's no ceiling to what you might accomplish." The endorsement from Thompson translated into a formal coaching arrangement funded by Taylor personally rather than through Westfield, with the retired player committing to monthly visits supplemented by video sessions and a detailed training program overseen by Coach Henderson, creating a development pathway for Darius that would have been utterly inaccessible to most children from neighborhoods like Pinewood. While the baseball field progressed and Darius's training intensified, other forces were gathering in opposition to both projects, centered around Victor Carson, the 58-year-old CEO of Carson Industries, whose initial connection to the attack on Taylor had been carefully obscured through layers of deniable arrangements. Carson, seated in his downtown office with its panoramic view of Ashton's most prosperous districts, received detailed reports from various sources about Westfield's activities in Pinewood, his clenched jaw and narrowed eyes revealing genuine anger about developments that threatened both his business interests and his considerable political influence in the city. Unlike Taylor, whose wealth derived primarily from technology before expanding into real estate, Carson had built his fortune through generations of local development, his family name appearing on numerous buildings throughout Ashton, and his company maintaining deep connections with city officials through campaign contributions, social relationships, and occasionally more direct financial arrangements disguised as consulting fees or investment opportunities. The baseball field site represented a particularly frustrating obstacle because Carson Industries had already secured preliminary approval through back channels for a luxury condominium development on that precise location, a project now indefinitely postponed by Taylor's public relations-oriented renovation, with several city council members suddenly claiming no recollection of previous discussions regarding the property's availability for private development. Councilman James Reynolds entered Carson's office without knocking, their relationship transcending normal business formalities, the politician's expensive suit and confident demeanor belying his humble origins in Pinewood itself, a background he referenced frequently in campaign speeches, but rarely in private conversations with power brokers like Carson. Reynolds, one of only 2 black members of the city council, had built his political career on carefully calibrated racial politics, presenting himself to white voters as reasonable and business-friendly, while assuring black constituents he would advocate for their interests once he had sufficient influence. A balancing act that had secured him 3 terms in office, but delivered questionable benefits to the communities he claimed to represent. The conversation between Carson and Reynolds focused on strategies for disrupting Taylor's sudden community involvement, with the councilman suggesting that he could begin questioning the billionaire's motives in community forums, planting seeds of doubt about whether this white savior routine was merely a prelude to more aggressive development once media attention shifted elsewhere. I can start suggesting he's using this Williams kid as a token. Get people wondering if he's just sports washing his company's reputation before the real gentrification begins, Reynolds proposed, his political instincts identifying the racial dynamics as the most effective pressure point in the situation. Carson agreed, but emphasized the need for subtlety, adding that his sources within the city building department could begin finding regulatory issues with the baseball field construction, creating delays and cost overruns that might test Taylor's commitment to the project if it began affecting Westfield's quarterly performance metrics. The field renovation encountered its first significant obstacle 3 days later when city inspectors arrived unannounced at the construction site. Clipboard-wielding officials suddenly discovering numerous code violations and permit irregularities that had somehow escaped notice during initial approvals. Their unexpected scrutiny coinciding with an article in the Ashton Tribune questioning whether Taylor's interest in one exceptional child would translate into meaningful change for Pinewood families facing displacement from Westfield's ongoing property acquisitions. Coach Henderson recognized the coordinated nature of these challenges immediately, having navigated enough city bureaucracy during his teaching career to recognize politically motivated obstruction, though he kept these observations to himself while assuring the increasingly anxious construction crew that Taylor would resolve the permit issues promptly. The situation escalated when community meetings about the baseball field became forums for broader discussions about gentrification and corporate responsibility, with Councilman Reynolds positioning himself as asking difficult but necessary questions about Westfield's long-term plans for Pinewood, while simultaneously praising Taylor's generous gesture toward Darius, the calculated ambivalence designed to create maximum uncertainty, while maintaining plausible deniability about opposing popular community improvements. Darius, continuing his training despite the construction delays, overheard enough adult conversations to understand that the baseball field had become entangled in complex issues beyond his full comprehension, his 10-year-old perspective simplifying the situation to wondering why adults would fight against something that would benefit neighborhood children, a question he posed directly to Taylor during one of their increasingly regular meetings. The billionaire's response revealed both growing genuine attachment to Darius and increasing frustration with the political maneuvering, his explanation of business rivalries and regulatory challenges framed in terms the boy could understand, while carefully avoiding disparaging specific individuals or revealing the depth of Carson's apparent vendetta against both Westfield and Taylor personally. Sometimes people oppose good things because they had different plans, or because they don't trust the intentions behind them, Taylor explained, unconsciously echoing concerns Janelle had expressed about his own initial appearance in their lives, the irony not lost on the increasingly perceptive Darius. The relationship between Taylor and the Williams family continued evolving as autumn progressed, with Janelle gradually allowing herself limited trust in the billionaire's consistency, as he maintained weekly visits to check on both the stalled construction and Darius's development, these interactions forcing Taylor to confront daily realities of Pinewood residents that his previous business decisions had affected without his direct awareness. A breakthrough in their complicated dynamic occurred when Taylor, arriving for a scheduled meeting with Darius and Coach Henderson, found Janelle distraught over their building's broken heating system and the landlord's refusal to make timely repairs despite approaching winter temperatures, a situation Taylor addressed with a single phone call after learning the property was actually owned by a Westfield subsidiary, his corporate authority immediately accomplishing what Janelle's repeated requests had not. The incident simultaneously demonstrated Taylor's genuine desire to help and the profound power imbalance that made such assistance both meaningful and problematic, highlighting questions about systemic solutions versus individual interventions that neither the Williams family nor the billionaire had simple answers for, their personal connection existing within but not resolving broader societal contradictions about race, class, and opportunity in America. Winter arrived in Ashton with unusual ferocity, temperatures plummeting below 20 degrees Fahrenheit as heavy snow blanketed the city, transforming the partially completed baseball field into a ghostly outline beneath drifts that obscured the progress made during autumn, the construction equipment sitting idle under white covers like prehistoric beasts in hibernation. The weather-related pause in development coincided with growing pressure on Jerome Taylor from multiple directions. The initial burst of positive publicity surrounding his commitment to Pinewood having faded, while questions about Westfield's broader activities intensified, creating a complex business environment that demanded increasing portions of the CEO's attention. In the sleek downtown offices of Westfield Corporation, Taylor sat at the head of a conference table surrounded by his executive leadership team, their expressions ranging from concerned to openly skeptical as quarterly projections were discussed, several board members questioning the allocation of resources to what Chief Financial Officer Patricia Donovan diplomatically referred to as community engagement initiatives, but which others more bluntly called distractions from core business objectives. Michael Fletcher, Westfield's chief operating officer and Taylor's longest-serving executive, presented market analysis suggesting that delays in several development projects, including those in Pinewood, were affecting investor confidence, his carefully neutral tone nonetheless conveying implied criticism of Taylor's recent priorities, particularly his personal involvement with the Williams family. The corporate dynamics reflected broader tensions as Taylor found himself increasingly caught between his genuine commitment to Darius and the baseball field project and his responsibilities to shareholders and employees who depended on Westfield's continued financial performance, a balancing act complicated by his growing recognition that the company's traditional development approach often harmed communities like Pinewood, despite creating value by conventional business metrics. Personal pressure arrived in unexpected form when Taylor's ex-wife Elizabeth contacted him after seeing national coverage of the baseball field announcement, her initial message expressing surprise at his involvement with charity cases before transitioning to pointed concerns about his public image and potential vulnerability, observations that might have seemed merely self-interested had they not partially echoed private doubts. Taylor occasionally acknowledged to himself during late-night reflections, "Jerome, while I admire your sudden philanthropic spirit, you must realize how this looks," Elizabeth said during their phone conversation, her voice carrying the particular blend of concern and condescension that had characterized the final years of their marriage. A middle-aged white billionaire taking special interest in a young black boy from the projects has certain optics you seem oblivious to, especially in this political climate where everything gets twisted. Are you prepared for the questions and insinuations that will inevitably come? Taylor had dismissed her concerns as paranoid and possibly racist, yet found himself unsettled by the conversation, particularly as similar innuendos began appearing in comment sections beneath articles about his ongoing mentorship of Darius. The ugliness of such speculation, revealing yet another dimension of America's racial pathologies that the boy would eventually have to navigate. While Taylor grappled with corporate and personal complications, Darius faced his own intensifying challenges at Edison Middle School, where his connection to the famous billionaire had transformed his social status in ways both beneficial and problematic, creating a fishbowl existence where every action and achievement was scrutinized through the lens of his unexpected relationship with Taylor. Some teachers who had previously overlooked his academic potential suddenly discovered his hidden talents and offered extra assistance, their newfound attention transparently connected to the prominent white benefactor rather than genuine recognition of Darius's capabilities, a dynamic the perceptive 10-year-old recognized even without the vocabulary to fully articulate it. More painful were the changed peer relationships as former friends like Kevin Jackson began referring to Darius as Taylor's special project or pet, while others approached with sudden interest that felt more connected to proximity to celebrity than genuine friendship, leaving Darius increasingly isolated and confused about his place in the social hierarchy. The most disturbing incident occurred in late January, when Darius found his locker vandalized with crude drawings and the word sellout scrawled across his baseball glove. The implication that his association with Taylor somehow constituted racial betrayal particularly hurtful, coming from classmates who shared his background and community. These accumulated pressures manifested in Darius's first serious argument with his mother, when Janelle discovered his grades slipping despite the improved resources and opportunities Taylor had helped arrange, her frustration breaking through usually careful restraint as she reminded her son that Taylor's interest might be temporary, while education offered permanent pathways forward. "Do you think that white man will still be around when the cameras move on to the next heartwarming story?" Janelle asked during a particularly tense exchange, immediately regretting the harshness, but unable to fully retract concerns born from life experience rather than cynicism. Mr. Wanzarov, "Taylor seems genuine, Darius, and I'm grateful for what he's done, but history gives black folks reasons to be cautious about white saviors, especially rich ones with business interests in our neighborhoods." The conversation left Darius confused and defensive, torn between recognizing the wisdom in his mother's caution and his growing genuine attachment to Taylor, whose consistent attention and interest in his development had begun filling emotional spaces left by his absent father, creating complicated feelings the boy lacked sufficient experience to fully process. Victor Carson's opposition to Taylor and the baseball field project continued through multiple channels, most visibly through increasingly critical media coverage questioning Westfield's motives in Pinewood, stories that appeared with suspicious regularity in publications connected to Carson's extensive business network. More damaging were the whisper campaigns in business and political circles suggesting Taylor's interest in urban development was waning, as evidenced by construction delays, conveniently omitting that these delays stemmed largely from regulatory obstacles created by Carson's allies in city government. Carson's most effective strategy, however, emerged through Councilman Reynolds, who positioned himself as representing authentic community concerns while questioning whether a baseball field primarily benefiting one talented child represented meaningful investment in Pinewood's collective needs, his rhetoric skillfully deploying racial justice language to undermine a project that threatened his patron's development plans. "We appreciate Mr. Taylor's interest in our community," Reynolds stated during a neighborhood association meeting, emphasizing the word "our," despite having moved from Pinewood to an exclusive suburb years earlier, but we must ask whether resources focused on a single exceptional child with a marketable skill represent genuine commitment to addressing systemic issues affecting Pinewood families. The councilman's comments received thoughtful nods from many residents who recognized legitimate questions about equity and sustainability behind the performative concern, the complexity of their reaction demonstrating that even beneficial projects required community input and ownership rather than merely wealthy beneficence, regardless of intentions. The most significant development occurred in early February when Taylor, reviewing quarterly property acquisition reports, discovered irregularities in Westfield's Pinewood transactions that suggested someone within his organization was potentially coordinating with outside interests. Specifically, properties being purchased at inflated prices through shell companies that investigation revealed had connections to Carson Industries. Simultaneously, Darius overheard a conversation between construction supervisors indicating that the baseball field site had originally been slated for commercial development in Westfield's internal plans before Taylor's attack and subsequent relationship with the Williams family, information that created new questions about whether the renovation represented a genuine change in corporate philosophy or merely a temporary deviation based on personal gratitude and public relations considerations. Seeds of mutual doubt multiplied during a particularly challenging week when Taylor was forced to cancel 2 scheduled coaching sessions with Darius due to an investor crisis requiring his presence in New York. The missed appointments coinciding with increasing tensions at school that left the boy feeling abandoned precisely when he most needed stability and support. Coach Henderson attempted to bridge the growing uncertainty, his straightforward manner and consistent presence providing continuity for Darius, while his practical experience with institutional dynamics helped contextualize Taylor's corporate challenges without excusing the impact of his absence, the former teacher's genuine commitment to both the baseball field and Darius's development, transcending the political and business maneuvering that threatened both projects. Matters reached a critical point when construction equipment arrived unannounced at the baseball field site one Wednesday afternoon. Workers beginning to dismantle the partial structures and remove materials without explanation, the sudden activity prompting Coach Henderson to contact both Taylor and city officials seeking clarification about apparent permit revocations that no one would officially confirm or deny. The situation crystallized the precarious position of community improvements dependent on corporate goodwill rather than institutional commitment, the baseball field's uncertain status serving as visible metaphor for broader questions about development, race, and power in American cities where decisions affecting thousands of lives often occurred in private conversations between wealthy individuals with limited accountability to those most impacted by their choices. When Taylor finally arrived at the Williams apartment that evening, having rushed back from New York upon receiving Coach Henderson's urgent messages, he found Darius uncharacteristically withdrawn, the boy's emotional walls visibly raised as Taylor attempted to explain the construction complications as temporary regulatory issues rather than abandonment of the project. The conversation reached an impasse when Darius directly asked whether Taylor had originally planned to build apartments on the baseball field site before their chance encounter in the alley, the simple question containing complex implications about authenticity, motivation, and the potential transactional nature of their relationship. Taylor's hesitation before answering, his instinctive calculation about transparency versus reassurance, lasted only seconds but communicated volumes to Darius, whose developing but acute sensitivity to adult evasions had been honed by years of economic insecurity and institutional disappointments, the moment creating a fracture in their connection that mere words could neither fully explain nor easily repair. March winds howled outside Westfield's headquarters as Jerome Taylor paced his corner office, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of Ashton's skyline that he barely noticed, his attention fixed instead on the stack of financial documents spread across his desk and the growing realization that the betrayal he suspected had been unfolding beneath his nose for months. The CEO had spent 3 sleepless nights personally reviewing every Pinewood transaction after discovering the initial irregularities, his methodical analysis revealing a pattern of manipulated appraisals, diverted properties, and strategic delays that collectively undermined both the baseball field project and Westfield's broader development plans, while benefiting unnamed competitors who further investigation suggested were shell companies connected to Carson Industries. Taylor's administrative assistant interrupted his contemplation with news that Michael Fletcher had returned from his meeting with city officials and was waiting outside, the COO having been summoned to explain discrepancies in several documents bearing his signature, a conversation Taylor had postponed for 48 hours to ensure he had comprehensive evidence before confronting his longest-serving executive. Fletcher entered with his customary confidence, his tailored suit and practiced smile, projecting the corporate assurance that had made him an effective operational leader and Taylor's trusted deputy for nearly a decade. Though today the CEO noticed subtle signs of tension in his colleague's posture and overly casual greeting. Taylor dispensed with preliminaries, sliding a folder across the desk containing permit applications for the baseball field with annotations showing deliberate errors that guaranteed rejection, documents Fletcher had personally overseen despite assigning blame to junior staff when the issues emerged. Would you like to explain why my chief operating officer has been deliberately sabotaging a project I personally guaranteed to the community, or should we skip to the part where you tell me who you're really working for?" Taylor asked. His tone conversational despite the gravity of the accusation, years of high-stakes negotiations having taught him that emotional displays rarely yielded useful information. Fletcher's expression cycled through surprise, indignation, and calculation before settling into a resigned acknowledgement that further denial would be pointless, his response revealing both professional rationalization and genuine conviction about his actions. "I've been trying to protect this company from your midlife crisis or white guilt project or whatever this baseball field obsession represents," Fletcher stated without apology, straightening his tie in an unconscious gesture of self-justification. "The board is concerned, Jerome. Our stock is down 12% since you started this community savior routine. Institutional investors are asking questions about leadership stability, and you've jeopardized hundreds of millions in development potential because some kid threw a ball at the right moment." The betrayal cut deeper as Fletcher continued, explaining that he had initially only delayed the baseball field project, hoping Taylor would lose interest once the publicity value diminished, but had gradually coordinated more extensively with Carson's organization after concluding that Westfield's CEO had lost objective business judgment, justifying these actions as necessary corporate governance rather than personal disloyalty. "Victor Carson approached me after seeing you turn a prime development location into a children's playground," Fletcher admitted as the conversation intensified. "He suggested your emotional decisions were creating a leadership vacuum that was bad for the market and the city's development. I agreed to provide certain information in exchange for assurances about Westfield's existing investments and my future role if the board eventually recognizes the need for new leadership." Across town in the Williams apartment, a parallel betrayal unfolded as Councilman Reynolds sat at their small kitchen table, his expensive watch and manicured nails contrasting sharply with the worn Formica surface as he smiled reassuringly at Janelle while sliding a folder of his own across to her, the contents purporting to show Westfield's actual plans for the baseball field site once the current publicity campaign concluded. "These documents came to my office through concerned sources within the company," Reynolds explained, his voice carrying the practiced sincerity that had won him 3 elections. "They show that Taylor's baseball field is designed as a temporary installation with a 3-year operational window before conversion to mixed-use development, with the first phase including retail space and market-rate apartments." Janelle studied the papers with growing concern, recognizing letterhead and signature styles that matched official communications she had previously seen from Westfield, though something about the document's convenient appearance and Reynolds' sudden interest in their family situation triggered her natural skepticism. "Why would Taylor invest so much in Darius's training if the field is temporary?" she questioned, maternal protection overriding intimidation by the councilman's position and formal demeanor. Reynolds had anticipated this objection, his response revealing the calculated nature of Carson's strategy as he suggested that Taylor's interest in Darius was genuine but compartmentalized from his business decisions, a personal project rather than institutional commitment, potentially including provisions for the boys' development separate from community access to baseball facilities. He's preparing Darius for private school and elite training facilities while giving the community a temporary field that photographs well for annual reports, Reynolds proposed, the interpretation maligning Taylor's intentions while containing just enough plausibility to plant serious doubts. "I'm not saying Taylor doesn't care about your son, Janelle. I'm saying corporate philanthropy always serves corporate interests first, and people like us need to recognize when we're being used as the sympathetic faces for business strategies." The councilman's most effective manipulation came when he transitioned from warnings to opportunities, offering Janelle a position as community liaison for his office, with significantly higher salary than her current combined income from 2 jobs, presenting the role as recognition of her intelligence and community standing rather than the effective bribe it actually represented. "This isn't about choosing sides," Reynolds assured her as he sensed her internal conflict. "This is about ensuring Pinewood residents have authentic representation by someone who understands their reality, not filtered through billionaires who discover poverty exists only when it affects their public image. Darius, returning home from baseball practice to find the councilman in their kitchen, immediately sensed the tension beneath the polite conversation. His growing perceptiveness, allowing him to recognize Reynolds' overly familiar manner with his mother and the careful way adults moderated their discussion when he entered. Later that evening, after Reynolds departed leaving his business card and job offer documentation, Darius questioned his mother about the unexpected visit, his direct inquiry reflecting both childlike curiosity and premature maturity born from navigating adult systems that frequently overlooked children's awareness of circumstances affecting their lives. "Is Councilman Reynolds telling the truth about Mr. Taylor planning to get rid of the baseball field?" Darius asked, as they washed dishes together, the mundane routine providing space for difficult conversations that might feel too intense if directly confronted. "Do you think Mr. Taylor has just been pretending to care about us?" Janelle measured her response carefully, balancing honesty about her own uncertainty with recognition of Darius's genuine attachment to Taylor, unwilling to either naively dismiss concerns or prematurely destroy a relationship that had brought her son both opportunity and emotional support during a challenging period. "I don't know for certain what Mr. Taylor's long-term plans are," she acknowledged, passing him a plate to dry. "People can have complicated motives, caring about individuals while still making business decisions that hurt communities. What I do know is that you need to prepare yourself for people coming into our lives temporarily, especially people from different worlds with different priorities." The maternal caution, delivered with love rather than cynicism, nonetheless added to Darius's growing confusion about his relationship with Taylor, creating emotional turmoil that affected his performance at the special training session the following day. His usually perfect accuracy, faltering as intrusive thoughts about betrayal and abandonment competed with technical instruction about grip and follow-through. Marcus Williams faced his own version of betrayal and temptation when approached at the construction site by former friends now affiliated with local drug distributors, their conversation superficially about catching up, but ultimately offering significant money for information about security systems being installed at the baseball field facilities. The implication that access to expensive equipment might be valuable to certain interested parties. Despite financial pressures and lingering resentment about wider societal inequities, Marcus rejected their proposition, his protective instincts toward Darius and growing pride in legitimate employment outweighing momentary financial opportunity, though the encounter reinforced his awareness that Pinewood residents constantly navigated ethical challenges that more privileged citizens could comfortably judge without experiencing. The multiple betrayals converged at a hastily organized community meeting about the baseball field's future, the local church basement filled beyond capacity as residents demanded answers about construction delays and conflicting information regarding Westfield's intentions. Taylor arrived expecting routine questions about timeline and facilities, unprepared for the hostile atmosphere created by strategically circulated documents and carefully planted community concerns orchestrated by Reynolds and Carson's representatives, the coordinated nature of the opposition becoming apparent only after several seemingly unrelated individuals raised identical talking points about corporate exploitation and token philanthropy. The tension reached its breaking point when Reynolds publicly questioned whether Taylor's interest in Darius Williams represented genuine community investment or merely the acquisition of a talented black child as a pet project to rehabilitate a corporate image tarnished by displacement of black families. The racially charged framing designed to create maximum discomfort and defensive reaction. Darius, seated between his mother and Coach Henderson, watched Taylor's face as the accusation landed, studying the billionaire's expression for evidence confirming or refuting his private fears about the authenticity of their relationship, seeking reassurance that their connection transcended the complicated racial and economic context surrounding it. When community activist Deshaun Jackson directly asked Taylor to commit unconditionally to maintaining the baseball field for 20 years, regardless of market conditions or development opportunities, the businessman hesitated momentarily before offering a carefully qualified response about balancing community needs with fiduciary responsibilities, his corporate training automatically engaging. before he recognized the damage his equivocation was causing to already fragile trust. Darius interpreted the hesitation and qualified language as confirmation of his worst fears. The perceived betrayal compounded by having occurred publicly, the emotional wound driving him to stand abruptly and walk out of the meeting despite his mother's attempt to stop him. His exit, creating a visual punctuation mark to the community's collective suspicion that Taylor's commitment might prove as transient as previous promises from powerful outside interests. Taylor attempted to follow, but was intercepted by concerned residents with additional questions. His position literally trapped between institutional responsibilities and personal relationship, the physical constraint mirroring the larger societal constraints that complicated genuine connection across racial and economic divisions, regardless of individual intentions or particular exceptions that might temporarily bridge, but not eliminate, structural separation. April sunshine belied the gathering storm as Jerome Taylor faced Westfield's board of directors in the company's sleek conference room. 18 impeccably dressed men and women seated around a polished table worth more than most Pinewood residents earned annually, their expressions reflecting the peculiar combination of deference and judgment that characterized corporate governance in American business. Michael Fletcher sat opposite Taylor, rather than in his usual position at the CEO's right hand, the physical distance symbolic of their now openly adversarial relationship since Fletcher had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation of his communications with Carson Industries, though today's emergency meeting suggested the COO retained significant board support despite these revelations. Board Chair Victoria Harrington opened proceedings with practice neutrality, referencing shareholder concerns about Westfield's recent performance before introducing Fletcher's presentation on strategic realignment, corporate euphemism for abandoning Taylor's community initiatives and returning to aggressive development priorities that had characterized the company's most profitable periods. Fletcher's presentation methodically detailed financial impacts of the baseball field project and associated community commitments. The projected costs displayed in red figures on immaculate slides designed to trigger investor anxiety, contrasted with alternative development scenarios showing substantially higher returns if the property were repurposed for commercial use as originally planned. While the Williams situation created valuable short-term publicity, Fletcher concluded with calculated reasonableness. Continuing this charitable digression threatens our market position precisely when Carson Industries has made an acquisition offer 15% below our actual value because they perceive leadership instability and strategic drift. The revelation of Carson's formal purchase offer transformed the meeting's dynamics. Several board members, previously sympathetic to Taylor's community initiatives, now visibly reconsidering their positions as fiduciary responsibility, competed with personal loyalty, the financial implications of rejecting the offer potentially affecting their own substantial stock holdings. Taylor recognized the carefully orchestrated nature of the situation, Carson having strategically timed the acquisition attempt to coincide with project delays his allies had helped create, the businessman admiring the tactical effectiveness, even while recognizing its fundamental corruption and the human consequences for Pinewood residents, whose lives were being treated as collateral damage in corporate maneuvering. Across town at Edison Middle School, Darius Williams faced his own breaking point as accumulated stresses from the deteriorating situation with Taylor, combined with ongoing academic challenges and increased bullying from classmates, resentful of his brief celebrity and subsequent perceived special treatment. The incident began in the cafeteria when 8th grader Tyler Bennington loudly questioned whether Darius would need to find another rich white man to save him, now that Taylor had apparently abandoned the baseball field project. The deliberate provocation, containing both racial implications and personal attack. Witnesses later disagreed about exactly what happened next, but security camera footage showed Darius responding verbally before Tyler escalated to physical shoving, culminating in a brief but intense altercation that left both boys with minor injuries before teachers intervened, the entire incident lasting less than 30 seconds but generating consequences entirely disproportionate to its duration or severity. Principal Watkins applied disciplinary policies with the selective enforcement characteristic of many American educational institutions, focusing on Darius's response rather than the provocation, while noting his history of behavioral challenges despite minimal previous disciplinary record, the administration recommending 2 weeks suspension with potential expulsion hearing, despite Coach Henderson's vigorous advocacy for contextual consideration. When Taylor attempted to intervene through his foundation's educational connections, having previously discussed potential private school scholarships for Darius, his efforts backfired dramatically as school administrators questioned the unusual interest of a wealthy white man in a specific black student. The insinuation carrying ugly historical undertones that Taylor recognized too late were impossible to address directly without appearing defensive or potentially confirming unconscious biases operating beneath the surface of institutional decision-making. The situation deteriorated further when Janelle Williams, having missed work to attend multiple school meetings regarding Darius's situation, was informed her position at the hospital cafeteria was being eliminated due to budget restructuring, though colleagues suggested the timing conveniently addressed management frustration with her recent absences and schedule accommodation requests. The loss of her primary income source created immediate financial pressure that made Reynolds' job offer increasingly difficult to reject, despite her continuing suspicions about his motivations and connections to Carson. Industries, the practical requirements of supporting her family competing with principled concerns about becoming complicit in undermining Taylor's projects, however complicated her feelings about the businessman himself had become. Marcus Williams faced his own crisis when arrested during a routine traffic stop that escalated when officers claimed to detect marijuana odor in his vehicle, the subsequent search revealing nothing illegal, but resulting in a 24-hour detention for resisting arrest after Marcus questioned the constitutional basis for the search, the incident occurring suspiciously, soon after he had begun asking questions among neighborhood contacts about Carson's business practices and Reynolds' sudden interest in their family. These cascading pressures converged as Taylor discovered evidence of systematic corruption extending far beyond Fletcher's betrayal. Internal documents revealing that Carson had compromised multiple city departments through strategic hiring and consulting arrangements with officials' family members, creating an informal network that facilitated preferential treatment for his developments while creating obstacles for competitors, particularly in historically black neighborhoods, where resident objections could be more easily dismissed by authorities than in wealthier white areas with political connections and resources for sustained opposition. The ethical dilemma confronting Taylor became increasingly complex as he recognized that publishing evidence of Carson's corruption would necessarily implicate Westfield in earlier similar practices under previous leadership, including his own father's tenure as founder and CEO, potentially destroying the company's value and affecting thousands of employees, while also revealing his own complicity through years of inattention to operational details he had delegated while focusing on technological innovation and market expansion. Simultaneously, Darius made his own significant discovery when sorting through baseball equipment Taylor had purchased for his training, finding preliminary design documents for the baseball field site dated several weeks before their encounter in the alley, blueprints showing an initial community recreation concept subsequently replaced by commercial development plans but reinstated and expanded after the attack, suggesting Taylor had contemplated neighborhood investment before their meeting, but abandoned it under business pressure, until their connection provided both moral clarity and public relations opportunity to pursue his initially better instincts. This complex reality challenged Darius's simplistic understanding of betrayal versus loyalty, introducing the possibility that human motivations and institutional constraints operated in tensions that defied easy categorization as either purely self-interested or purely altruistic, a sophisticated insight beyond most 10-year-olds, but increasingly necessary for children navigating America's complicated racial and economic landscape where straightforward narratives rarely captured actual lived experience. The multiple breaking points created a moment of decision for both Taylor and the Williams family, their individual choices constrained by systemic pressures, yet retaining elements of genuine agency within those constraints. Their parallel situations reflecting broader questions about how individual relationships and specific ethical decisions operate within and occasionally transcend institutional structures designed primarily to maintain existing power arrangements rather than facilitate authentic human connection or community flourishing, particularly across historically enforced racial and economic boundaries that American society simultaneously disavowed and reinforced through countless daily interactions and policy decisions. Morning light filtered through blinds onto scattered documents covering Jerome Taylor's kitchen table. The billionaire's home office transformed into an impromptu command center as he worked through his third consecutive night, analyzing financial records, property transfers, and communication logs that collectively revealed the extensive corruption network Victor Carson had established throughout Ashton's government and business community. Dressed in wrinkled clothing he hadn't changed in 48 hours, Taylor barely resembled the polished executive from corporate photographs, his appearance reflecting the internal transformation occurring as he reconciled his identity as successful businessman with emerging commitments to community accountability, a journey catalyzed by his relationship with Darius, but extending beyond personal gratitude to fundamental questions about wealth, responsibility, and the human consequences of abstract market decisions. The evidence Taylor had compiled documented how Carson Industries systematically undermined community development through selective enforcement of regulations against competing projects while fast-tracking their own through compromised officials, particularly targeting historically black neighborhoods like Pinewood, where political resistance carried less consequence for elected officials than similar actions in affluent areas with high voter participation and donor concentration. Most disturbing were the connections to Westfield's own practices under previous leadership, including Taylor's father, whose private journal, Taylor, had discovered while searching company archives for historical precedent, the handwritten entries revealing explicit strategies to depress property values through selective service reduction before acquisition, tactics presented in business-neutral language that obscured the racial patterns evident when mapped against demographic data from corresponding decades. The painful recognition that his inherited wealth partially derived from such practices created both moral clarity and practical complication as Taylor contemplated publicly exposing systems his own company had previously exploited. Knowing institutional self-preservation instincts would likely result in board removal if he proceeded, effectively ending his control over Westfield's considerable resources that could potentially address historical harms if redirected appropriately. This internal deliberation was interrupted by an unexpected knock at his door, security monitors revealing Darius Williams standing alone on the front steps of Taylor's suburban home, the boy's determined expression visible even through the grainy footage, his presence at this location indicating both significant effort to travel from Pinewood and extraordinary purpose motivating the journey. Their conversation began awkwardly, mutual hurt and confusion, creating barriers that 10-year-old emotional vocabulary and adult professional defensiveness initially struggled to overcome, until Darius produced from his backpack several documents he had taken from Councilman Reynolds' office during a community meeting, explaining that he had used his throwing accuracy to distract office staff while retrieving papers left carelessly visible that appeared similar to those Reynolds had shown his mother. "I know stealing is wrong," Darius acknowledged without prompting, his moral reasoning sophisticated enough to recognize ethical complexity rather than absolute categories. "But people were lying about you in the baseball field, and I needed to know what was really happening." The documents provided final connections Taylor had been seeking, including direct evidence of payments from Carson to Reynolds disguised as consulting fees, communications regarding strategic opposition to the baseball field, and, most significantly, plans for luxury development on adjacent properties that would increase substantially in value once public recreational facilities were established nearby, revealing Carson's ultimate strategy of letting Taylor complete community improvements that would increase surrounding property values before acquiring them through shell companies already established for this purpose. The unexpected alliance reforming between Taylor and Darius gained additional dimension when Jerome Williams contacted Taylor directly after discovering inconsistencies in the employment contract Reynolds had offered, her administrative experience from hospital work allowing her to recognize unusual reporting requirements that suggested the position was designed more for information gathering than authentic community representation. Concurrently, Coach Henderson mobilized his extensive community network developed through decades teaching neighborhood children, connecting Taylor with longtime Pinewood residents who provided historical context about previous development promises and subsequent disappointments, creating comprehensive documentation of patterns rather than isolated incidents. The comeback strategy emerged organically through these collaborations, beginning with Taylor's decision to publicly acknowledge both Westfield's historical practices under previous leadership and his own initial commercial intentions for the baseball field site before his relationship with Darius prompted reconsideration. The transparency addressing community skepticism more effectively than defensive denial ever could, while simultaneously undermining Carson and Reynolds' attempts to position themselves as authentic community advocates compared to Taylor's supposedly recent and superficial interest. Practical resistance coalesced around protecting the partially completed baseball field when Carson-affiliated developers attempted to access the site with demolition equipment, citing permit irregularities that supposedly invalidated Westfield's construction authority. Community response was immediate and unexpected, dozens of Pinewood residents establishing continuous presence at the field, local construction workers volunteering labor during off-hours to continue development despite official delays, creating practical demonstration of neighborhood investment that complicated bureaucratic obstruction and generated compelling media coverage, challenging simplistic narratives about community versus development interests. Marcus Williams, recently released through intervention from a civil rights attorney Taylor had quietly arranged, contributed critical organizing capacity among younger residents, typically disengaged from formal political processes, his personal experience with selective enforcement creating authentic credibility that Taylor's resources alone could never establish regardless of intentions. The relationship between Taylor and the Williams family evolved through this period of shared purpose, moving beyond initial roles as benefactor and recipients toward more complex collaboration, recognizing distinct contributions and perspectives, their personal connection existing within, but not erasing broader structural contexts that continued shaping their relative positions and experiences despite individual exceptions to typical patterns. Taylor surprised both the Williams family and his corporate team by personally participating in baseball field construction alongside Pinewood volunteers, his expensive clothes replaced by work attire as he contributed physical labor under direction from experienced community members, the symbolic gesture substantiated by parallel financial and legal resources deployed against Carson's obstruction attempts, demonstrating commitment beyond publicity opportunities or temporary charitable interest. The coordinated resistance culminated in strategic preparation for the upcoming City Council meeting, where development priorities for the next fiscal year would be established. Taylor and the Williams family gathering community testimony documenting Carson's predatory practices while organizing transportation, ensuring unprecedented Pinewood representation at proceedings typically dominated by business interests and wealthier neighborhood associations. Carson's counteroffensive intensified as the meeting approached, pressure on Taylor escalating through both business channels where the acquisition offer gained board support and personal intimidation, including increasingly explicit threats regarding his continued relationship with Darius, suggesting public accusations that would damage both their reputations regardless of factual basis, the particularly American weaponization of racial history to prevent its actual address. The night before the council meeting, Taylor visited the Williams apartment for a conversation with Darius and Janelle that acknowledged both their genuine personal connection and its existence within systems designed to separate rather than unite their experiences and interests, creating space for authentic relationship without naive pretense that individual exceptions fundamentally altered broader structural realities, requiring institutional rather than merely interpersonal response. I want you to understand that I initially looked at Pinewood primarily as property values and development potential, Taylor admitted, his candor reflecting evolved understanding that trust required truth rather than performance. Meeting you changed my perspective, Darius, not just because you saved me, but because you forced me to see the human consequences of decisions I made from comfortable distance. That doesn't erase the systems we're still operating within or my continued benefits from them, but it does mean I'm committed to addressing them whether or not it costs me my company. Darius's response reflected wisdom beyond his years, observing that adults often presented choice as either uncompromising principles or practical compromise, when actually most important decisions involved pursuing principles through available practical paths. His baseball training having taught him that perfect technique meant little without adaptability to actual game conditions. You don't have to be perfect to be good, he told Taylor with simple eloquence that captured their complicated journey together. You just have to keep trying even when you make mistakes or things get hard. As they prepared for the council confrontation, Taylor, Darius, and the growing coalition of Pinewood advocates recognized that regardless of immediate outcome, their developing model of collaborative resistance, combining community knowledge with institutional resources, represented potential pathway for addressing long-standing patterns of development that typically prioritized profit over people, particularly in communities historically excluded from decision processes affecting their neighborhoods, suggesting possibility for relationship across difference that neither denied structural realities nor accepted their inevitability. Every seat in Ashton's city council chambers was filled as residents from across the economic spectrum crowded the usually half-empty municipal building, television cameras positioned strategically to capture the unprecedented public interest in proceedings normally considered procedural rather than dramatic. Council President Margaret Wilson called the meeting to order with visible discomfort at the standing room-only attendance, her gavel struggling to overcome excited conversation as Jerome Taylor entered alongside Darius, Janelle, and Marcus Williams, their unified arrival, creating visual counterpoint to Carson Industries, executives clustering near Councilman Reynolds, whose usually confident demeanor appeared strained as he observed community members carrying folders identical to those containing evidence of his connections to Carson. The formal agenda included final approval for several development projects, including the contested baseball field site, the seemingly bureaucratic decision representing culmination of months of manipulation, resistance, and relationship building that had transformed an abandoned recreational facility into symbolic battleground for competing visions of urban development and community voice. Taylor had formally requested speaking time, his position as CEO of Westfield Corporation guaranteeing procedural accommodation despite behind-the-scenes attempts to limit his presentation, though few anticipated his opening statement transferring most of his allocated minutes to Pinewood residents themselves, beginning with Darius, who approached the microphone with documentation, carefully organized in sequence developed through late-night strategy sessions with his mother, Coach Henderson, and Taylor. My name is Darius Williams. I am 10 years old, and this is my neighborhood you're making decisions about, he began, his voice initially hesitant before finding rhythm and confidence as he described growing up in Pinewood, the closed baseball field that had once served as community gathering place, and his chance encounter with Taylor that had created unexpected connection across differences typically functioning as separation. The young boy's testimony transitioned to evidence presentation with sophistication belying his age, methodically displaying permit manipulations, selective enforcement patterns, and finally documentation of Carson's payments to Reynolds and other officials, the council chambers erupting in shocked murmurs, as connections between personal corruption and community consequences became undeniably visible through presentation designed for maximum clarity and impact. Reynolds attempted procedural objection, claiming inappropriateness of allowing a child to present accusations without proper investigation, his parliamentary maneuvering interrupted by Janelle Williams, approaching the microphone with additional documentation of Reynolds' attempted recruitment of her into Carson's influence network. Her testimony particularly powerful, given her reputation for integrity within Pinewood, and her previous reluctance to publicly challenge established authority despite private skepticism. The cumulative evidence created momentum for additional community voices, as longtime residents described historical patterns of development promises routinely broken when media attention shifted elsewhere, their personal experiences collectively revealing systematic rather than isolated practices targeting neighborhoods with limited political capital, particularly communities of color, where resident concerns could be more easily dismissed by officials dependent on donor relationships rather than constituent accountability for continued political careers. Victor Carson himself finally approached the microphone, his expensive suit and commanding presence reflecting decades cultivating authoritative image, his statement beginning with expressions of regret for misunderstandings, while suggesting community concerns represented manipulation by Westfield for competitive advantage rather than legitimate grievances, his corporate deflection strategy momentarily effective until interrupted by unexpected source. My father founded Carson Industries with similar practices. A voice called from the audience, revealing Carson's estranged daughter Rebecca, who had recently returned to Ashton after years' absence. Her testimony regarding conversations witnessed during childhood, providing insider confirmation of intentional strategies targeting vulnerable neighborhoods. Her appearance representing personal courage, transcending family loyalty when ethical considerations demanded accountability. The dramatic confrontation reached turning point when Reynolds, recognizing his position becoming untenable as evidence mounted, attempted hasty exit from chambers, only to be stopped by perfectly aimed baseball that struck door immediately beside his head, momentarily freezing him in place as security personnel responded to commotion. The throw immediately identifiable as Darius's work, though technically impossible to prove, creating symbolic echo of the alley encounter that had initiated these cascading events and relationships. Federal investigators waiting outside council chambers served warrants on Reynolds and two other officials based on evidence Taylor had provided through appropriate legal channels concurrent with community mobilization. The dual strategy, reflecting lessons learned about combining institutional accountability with grassroots organizing, rather than relying exclusively on either approach when addressing entrenched systems of power and privilege. In subsequent weeks, Carson Industries faced multiple investigations resulting in significant financial penalties and leadership changes, though the deeper structural issues enabling their practices remained embedded in economic and political systems designed to prioritize development interests over community stability, particularly in historically marginalized neighborhoods, demonstrating limitations of even successful resistance without fundamental institutional reconstruction. Jerome Taylor's position at Westfield underwent significant transformation as he voluntarily stepped down as CEO while maintaining substantial ownership stake, establishing independent community development fund with binding charter, requiring majority control by Pinewood residents themselves, the structure designed to correct power imbalance inherent in even well-intentioned philanthropy by transferring actual decision authority rather than merely advisory input. The baseball field completion occurred through unprecedented collaboration between Westfield resources and community expertise, professional contractors working alongside neighborhood volunteers with design input from future users, including children like Darius, who would actually play there, creating facility, reflecting actual needs rather than external assumptions about appropriate amenities or priorities. Beyond physical infrastructure, programming development similarly combined Taylor's connections for securing equipment and coaching expertise with community knowledge regarding scheduling accommodations for working families, transportation challenges, and cultural considerations affecting participation, creating model for genuine partnership rather than imposed solutions regardless of intentions. Most significant transformation occurred in relationship between Taylor and the Williams family as their connection evolved beyond initial rescue narrative and subsequent philanthropic dynamics toward more complex recognition of both. Genuine personal affection and continued structural differences. Their individual experience neither erasing broader societal patterns nor being completely determined by them, suggesting possibility for authentic relationship across difference that acknowledged rather than denied contextual realities. Darius received appropriate educational support and coaching development. His remarkable talent, nurtured through resources previously inaccessible, while remaining embedded within community that provided cultural grounding and perspective, often missing in typical talent development pipelines that extracted promising individuals from supporting environments. His potential pathway avoiding false choice between community connection and professional opportunity. The Williams family remained in improved but still recognizable Pinewood, rather than being displaced to supposedly better circumstances defined by external metrics. Their home and neighborhood enhanced through community-directed investment rather than completely transformed according to outside preferences or priorities, maintaining cultural continuity while addressing legitimate infrastructure needs and service gaps. Taylor redirected substantial personal resources toward supporting similar community-directed projects in other neighborhoods without insisting on control or recognition, having learned through experience with Darius and Pinewood that meaningful change required shifting power rather than merely resources, transforming decision processes rather than simply outcomes, particularly across historical divides, maintained through institutional arrangements rather than merely individual prejudice or preference. Full circle completion manifested during championship game of newly established Pinewood Youth Baseball League, Darius taking pitcher's mound before diverse audience, including residents across economic spectrum, Taylor watching from general admission bleachers rather than privileged viewing area, his presence acknowledged but not centered as community-celebrated collective achievement rather than individual intervention, regardless of genuine gratitude for catalyzing contributions and continued support. Most telling indicator of transformed relationship occurred after formal game conclusion. Darius gathering younger children, including Taylor's nephew visiting from out of town, the black child from Pinewood teaching fundamental throwing techniques to the white child from privilege, their interaction suggesting possibility for generation potentially moving beyond historical patterns without denying their continued existence or impact, recognizing difference while refusing its function as hierarchy or separation. The story of Darius Williams and Jerome Taylor ultimately transcended simplified narratives of heroism or rescue, revealing instead complex intersection of individual relationship with institutional constraints, personal transformation with structural limitations, their connection neither erasing broader societal realities nor being completely determined by them, suggesting authentic human relationship across difference representing necessary though insufficient component of addressing America's persistent racial and economic divides, requiring both interpersonal connection and institutional reconstruction rather than privileging either approach exclusively. As their journey demonstrated, genuine progress demands acknowledging both structural patterns and individual exceptions, recognizing institutional arrangements that systematically reproduce inequality, while maintaining possibility for relationships that transcend, though cannot alone transform those arrangements, holding simultaneously the reality of systems designed to separate and the possibility of connections that challenge their determinative power, however imperfectly and incompletely. What do you think about how racial divisions in America might be addressed through both individual relationships and institutional changes? How can we balance acknowledging historical patterns without assuming their inevitability? If this story resonated with you, please like, comment, subscribe, and share with others who might appreciate exploring these complex themes. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and may we all find courage to build connections across difference while working toward systems that support rather than undermine such relationships.